Most people don't know Canada just seized control of the resource that will decide the next World War. Friends, thank you for being here today. What if the most consequential transfer of power in modern history did not happen in a war room, did not happen at a summit, did not happen with the signing of a treaty broadcast across every television screen on Earth, but happened instead in a geology laboratory in a country that most of the world had spent a century underestimating? And what if that transfer is already complete? For over 100 years, the architecture of global power has rested on a single assumption, that the nations controlling energy resources control civilization itself. The British Empire understood this before anyone else. When coal powered the Industrial Revolution, Britain did not merely mine it. Britain weaponized it. Coal was not a commodity, it was leverage. It was the mechanism through which one island nation extended its authority across a quarter of the Earth's surface. When coal gave way to oil, the center of gravity shifted. The Middle East became the new fulcrum of global power. Wars were fought not over ideology, not over borders, not even over religion, but over the black liquid beneath the sand that kept factories running, armies moving, and economies breathing. Every student of history understands this pattern. Control the energy. Control the century. What very few people understand is that the pattern is repeating itself right now. Not in the Middle East, not in the South China Sea, not in any of the theaters where analysts are trained to look. It is repeating itself in the frozen silence of the Canadian Arctic, in the permafrost of the Northwest Territories, in the ancient geological formations beneath the Mackenzie Delta, where Canadian researchers have confirmed deposits of helium-3 so vast that the phrase energy resource no longer adequately describes what has been found. What has been found is a civilizational variable, and Canada controls it entirely. To understand why this matters, why this is not simply another energy story, it is necessary to understand what helium-3 actually is and why nations that quietly follow fusion energy research have been studying Canadian geological surveys with the attention governments reserve for strategic threats. Helium-3 is not a fuel in the conventional sense. It is the fuel required for nuclear fusion, the process that powers the sun itself. Unlike nuclear fission, which splits atoms and produces centuries of radioactive waste, fusion merges atoms and produces almost none. No greenhouse gases, no meltdown risk, no spent fuel rods that must be buried beneath mountains for 10,000 years. A single kilogram of helium-3, when used in a functioning fusion reactor, produces energy equivalent to approximately 20 million kilograms of coal. The energy density is not merely impressive, it is categorically different from anything human civilization has previously worked with. The reason fusion energy has remained theoretical for decades, despite billions in investment, despite sustained laboratory demonstrations, despite the physics being understood since the mid-20th century, is not scientific. It is material. Helium-3 is extraordinarily scarce on Earth. The isotope is produced by the solar wind, but Earth's magnetic field deflects nearly all of it before it can reach the surface. What little exists in terrestrial formations has been locked in rock for millions of years, present in quantities too small to fuel commercial energy systems. This scarcity is the wall between the civilization that exists today and the civilization that fusion energy would make possible. It is the reason fusion has always been described as the energy of the future, and always will be, the joke goes, because the future never arrives. The Canadian discovery changes the nature of that joke entirely. Geological surveys conducted across the Mackenzie Delta, the Beaufort Sea region, and sections of the Arctic archipelago have identified helium-3 concentrations that are not simply larger than anything previously found on Earth. They are larger by orders of magnitude. The deposits appear to result from unique geological conditions that preserved cosmic radiation absorption during periods when Earth's magnetic field was significantly weaker. Millions of years ago, when the planet's defenses against the solar wind were insufficient, and helium-3 accumulated in crystalline structures within ancient volcanic formations that permafrost has kept sealed ever since. Research teams from the University of Alberta, working in partnership with Natural Resources Canada, have confirmed through core sampling that the Canadian deposits represent energy potential exceeding total global consumption from all sources combined: oil, coal, natural gas, nuclear, hydroelectric, and renewables, for thousands of years forward. This is not a projection. This is a geological measurement of what exists beneath Canadian territory right now. The extraction technology is complex, but it is not beyond current engineering capabilities. The helium-3 is accessible through specialized drilling techniques similar to those used in deep geothermal projects, with cryogenic separation processes to isolate the isotope from surrounding material. Canadian companies working alongside government research institutions have already demonstrated prototype extraction systems capable of producing kilogram quantities from test sites in the Northwest Territories. The energy return on even early-stage extraction is extraordinary. Every kilogram extracted and delivered to a functioning fusion reactor represents energy value that no conventional commodity pricing system was designed to accommodate. At current fusion energy valuations, helium-3 is worth approximately $40 million per kilogram. The confirmed Canadian deposits, if valued on that basis, represent a figure that exceeds the combined gross domestic product of every nation on Earth. But that framing misunderstands what this resource actually is. This is not a commodity to be sold by the kilogram on international markets. This is the material precondition for the next phase of human civilization. Whoever controls it does not simply control an energy source. They control the terms on which the rest of the world enters the fusion age. Canada controls it entirely, without exception. The geopolitical implications are not subtle and they are not distant. The global power structure of the past century was built on the geography of oil. Countries like Saudi Arabia, Russia, Iran, and Venezuela exercised international influence to their populations, and economies would never otherwise have justified, because they sat atop the resource that industrial civilization required to function. The United States became the dominant global power of the 20th century partly because of its ability to secure oil access and control the sea lanes through which it moved. American foreign policy in the Middle East was fundamentally shaped by that single calculation. That entire architecture is now structurally obsolete, not because oil is running out, not because renewable energy has replaced it, but because a resource has been confirmed in Canadian territory that renders the oil age as historically finished as the age of sail. The transition will not be immediate. Economic systems do not transform overnight. Infrastructure does not become worthless in a single quarter. But the direction is no longer uncertain. The arc of the trajectory is fixed. When the first commercial fusion power plants come online using Canadian helium-3 as fuel, and draft assessments from multiple research institutions suggest this could occur within the next decade under current development timelines, the economic logic of every oil-dependent economy on Earth begins to collapse. Not quickly, not loudly, but with the same quiet, structural inevitability that ended every previous energy age. Saudi Arabia currently derives over 70% of government revenue from oil exports. Russia's leverage over European energy markets, accumulated over decades of pipeline construction and diplomatic pressure, rests entirely on the assumption that Europe requires Russian natural gas to function. The geopolitical influence that energy exporting nations have wielded for generations is not a permanent feature of international relations. It is a temporary condition that exists only as long as oil and gas remain indispensable. The Canadian discovery has set a timer on that indispensability. The response from established energy powers has already begun, quietly, through diplomatic channels, through corporate acquisition attempts, through classified conversations that do not appear in official records, but whose effects are visible in the behavior of sovereign wealth funds and state energy companies. Saudi officials have approached Canadian counterparts about partnership frameworks. Russian energy companies have sought acquisition stakes in Canadian Arctic development projects. American corporations have begun lobbying their own government to ensure preferential access to Canadian energy infrastructure under whatever framework emerges from the current period of strategic repositioning. None of this is coincidence. None of it is routine commercial activity. It is the behavior of nations that have recognized at the institutional level that the resource foundation of global power is shifting, and that Canada now sits at the center of that shift. The Canadian government has responded with a strategic sophistication that observers trained to underestimate this country consistently fail to anticipate. Rather than treating helium-3 as a raw export commodity, Ottawa has moved to build integrated supply chains, controlling the full value chain from extraction through energy production. The National Fusion Energy Corporation manages helium-3 extraction policy and ensures Canadian interests are structurally embedded in the commercialization of fusion technology rather than simply compensated for the raw material. This approach reflects a deliberate reading of history. Canada watched what happened to nations that exported raw oil without controlling refining, raw minerals without controlling processing. The lesson is consistent. The nation that extracts earns a fraction of the value captured by the nation that converts. Canada has decided, with this resource, not to repeat that pattern. Canadian universities have become the primary global centers for fusion energy research, as a direct consequence of proximity to the helium-3 deposits and government investment in academic infrastructure. International researchers and students are arriving in Canadian institutions not because of rankings or prestige, but because the material required to advance fusion science is in Canadian territory and Canadian laboratories. The intellectual capital accumulating around this resource is not separable from the resource itself. It is part of the strategic position Canada is building. The military implications extend beyond energy economics into domains that defense planners in Washington, Beijing, and Moscow are only beginning to fully process. Fusion-powered military systems would not require refueling or resupply chains in the conventional sense. Naval vessels powered by fusion reactors could maintain operational presence anywhere on Earth indefinitely. Ground forces would not be constrained by fuel logistics that currently limit the duration and range of conventional military operations. Directed energy weapons and electromagnetic systems that are currently impractical because of power requirements would become operationally viable. Countries with reliable access to fusion energy would possess military capabilities that countries dependent on fossil fuel logistics simply could not match over extended operational timelines. And access to fusion energy, in the early decades of its commercial development, means access to Canadian helium-3. This creates a new dimension of Canadian strategic leverage that has no historical precedent in the relationship between Canada and the major military powers. The environmental dimensions add a layer of moral legitimacy to Canadian resource control that oil-producing nations have never been able to claim. Helium-3 fusion produces no carbon emissions, no long-term radioactive waste, and no possibility of the kind of catastrophic accidents associated with fission reactors. At a moment when climate change is reshaping international politics and forcing every major economy to reckon with the costs of fossil fuel dependence, Canada has discovered the material solution to the problem that has defined the 21st century's most urgent policy debates. This is not simply a matter of economics or geopolitics, it is a matter of civilizational narrative. The nation that provides the clean energy solution to climate change gains not merely economic advantage, but the moral authority to shape the terms of the transition, to define the standards, set the prices, and determine the conditions under which the rest of the world enters the post-carbon age. Canada is positioned to be that nation, not through rhetoric, through geology. The communities growing around helium-3 extraction sites in Canada's northern territories are already beginning to transform. Regions that spent generations economically marginalized by their distance from industrial centers are becoming sites of high-technology infrastructure that will define strategic geography for the century ahead. Indigenous communities historically excluded from resource extraction benefits are being incorporated as partners, a shift with both moral and practical dimensions, since community support is essential for operational stability in remote locations. The broader economic transformation that fusion energy would enable reaches into every sector of the global economy. Transportation, which currently accounts for approximately 30% of global oil consumption, would be fundamentally restructured as fusion-powered systems replace internal combustion engines across every mode of movement. Industrial processes constrained by energy costs would become economically viable at scales currently impossible. Agricultural production in regions currently limited by water scarcity could be transformed by fusion-powered desalination systems that make fresh water abundant rather than scarce. The fundamental economic constraints that have defined what is possible for human civilization, where cities can exist, what can be manufactured where, which regions can feed which populations, are not permanent features of reality. They are consequences of energy scarcity. When energy approaches abundance, those constraints begin to dissolve, and the nation that controls the material pathway to abundance controls the shape of the civilization that emerges on the other side. Canada controls that pathway. The deposits are confirmed. The extraction technology is advancing, the institutional frameworks are being built, the international partnerships are being structured, the intellectual capital is accumulating. The strategic position is hardening with each passing month into something that will be extraordinarily difficult for any other nation to dislodge. This is not the future. This is the present, already determined at the structural level, waiting for the rest of the world to recognize what has occurred. Empires do not announce their endings. They continue operating on the assumptions that made them powerful long after those assumptions have been invalidated by changed circumstances. The oil-producing nations that currently exercise global influence based on fossil fuel revenues are not yet behaving as if their foundation is gone. But the foundation is gone. The geological reality beneath Canadian permafrost has already sealed the outcome. The only question remaining is how long it takes for the political and economic systems built on oil to recognize what the Earth has already decided. History does not wait for recognition. It records outcomes. The quiet neighbor to the north has discovered the resource that will decide which civilization leads the next 1,000 years. That discovery is not a future possibility. It has already happened. The world is simply in the interval between the event and the understanding of it. By the time that understanding arrives clearly enough to reshape mainstream political discourse, the strategic position will be locked. The extraction infrastructure will be built. The supply chains will be operational, the international dependencies will be established, and Canada will be what it has already become, the indispensable energy power of the fusion age, whether the rest of the world is ready to acknowledge it or not. History does not punish the unprepared with announcements. It simply continues. And what continues from this point forward continues on Canadian terms. Thank you for being here today. If this analysis has provided value, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for continued coverage of the structural shifts that are reshaping global power while most attention remains focused elsewhere. The developments that will define the next century are happening now. Most people will understand them only after the moment to respond has passed.